Hello, this is Dr. Llewellyn Eisen, and this lecture, which will probably be in two parts, considers the second part of the social context of the world in which Christianity will emerge, and that is the context of Greek and Roman religion. So, of course, you're familiar with this map by now, this map that shows some degree of the extent of the Roman Empire, and also a map that very imperfectly highlights some of the religious groups or religious theologies that were present in the time of late antiquity. Here we have, of course, this image representing Greek and Roman religion. We have Celtic indigenous religion, which is spread all the way across here. We have, of course, the religion of the Israelites, Judaism, Zoroastrianism, and indigenous Arabic religion. So this lecture is going to concern itself with Greek and Roman religion. It's worth keeping in mind that religion in the classical and the late antique world did not conform to our assumptions about what constitutes a religion, because remember, religion is a category that we've created. For the Greeks and the Romans, their activity that we would call religious did not conform to our understanding because there was no sacred scriptures, there was no priestly class, there was no religiously motivated moral code, which doesn't mean there weren't laws, and it doesn't mean there weren't moral codes, but they weren't religiously motivated. And there weren't doctrinal systems the way we find in Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. So it's a different way of approaching the divine. And so that's one of the things that we need to think about. In the Roman Empire, and this is something that Roman religious systems will have in common with Greek, there are distinct approaches to the divine that are quite different from how we in the contemporary world understand an approach to the divine. So on one level, you have the activity of the artistic world, one might say. So myth and art was one way through which one might approach the divine. And by myth here, I'm referring to the literature of Greco-Roman religious activity, divine beings, gods and goddesses. We tend to give that greater import than it had. Myth is not a word that means lie. It's an origin story that is fluid in nature. And these origin stories played a relatively marginal role in any kind of actual worship. Myths were never regarded as sacred scriptures as such. And the artistic reinforcement of these stories was also itself not necessarily considered divine. So that's one of the things we have to keep in mind, is that when you read or when you hear stories about minotaurs and Jupiter and Juno or Zeus and Hera, these aren't stories that people regarded as sacred scriptures. Okay? Another approach to the divine was among the philosophers, and this approach is the closest to what we would call religious, because the philosophers felt that the world offered a different way. The world itself, the physical world, offered itself a way of approaching the divine that myth and art did not. For the philosophers, a lot of the myth and art was problematic because, the divine beings engage in pretty fun, scandalous behavior. And for many philosophers, this was seen as, deeply problematic. For philosophers, if you held a moral view, this worked itself out through your daily life. So for philosophers, their moral views were grounded in their bodies. They were grounded in the physical. And this is something that we'll talk about more as the course proceeds. In terms of activity that we would probably call religious, that is taking place at a different level, and that's among the population. And so among the majority of people just living out their existence, their approach to the divine was usually through a cult with which they were connected. And a cult doesn't mean something bad. It doesn't mean a group of people that are led by a crazy person. That is a contemporary, very negative view of the word. A cult is simply a group that is dedicated to an idea or a person or a place. A very good analogy is a club, right? So if you're part of a club that is a theater club or a sport club or a Bible club or something, right? You are part of a cult. And it doesn't mean a bad thing. It just means this is the group to which you are dedicated. And so the population, for much of the population, their approach to the divine was through their specific cult or cults. So I want to focus on two ways in which religion was worked out in antiquity, two ways that will impact the development of Christianity. The first is that religion took place in two places, two modes of existence. And one is, of course, in the public. Now, because there was not a specific priestly class, public religion was done from the top down. And so, for example, in this case, you see individuals of the senatorial class who are engaged in discerning the answer to a question that has been put to the heavens. And you can see that they are looking at the entrails of this animal here, and the expectation is that how those entrails are read will give them information that they want. So this was one way that public religion assisted in providing answers for people about what was to come. Another example of public religion is, here we have Marcus Aurelius, who's engaged in offering sacrifice, and you can see the sacrificial animal here. Notice in both cases, you have bulls that are a representative of the sacrifice, which is, of course, something that all religious activity has in common, the notion that you give something in either in advance of a question that you ask or in thanksgiving for something that has maybe happened. But here you have Marcus Aurelius, the emperor, dressed as the priest, or functioning as the priest, is the priest, and you have citizens around him. So you have the imperial figure who's functioning as the high pontiff, the high bridge between the divine and the mortal. Another way that public religion worked itself out was through the activity of the Vestals. And you were given a passage on the Vestals in your reading that discussed who they were and some of the implications of deviation from that way of life. But just as a quick reminder, Vestals were public figures. They were young women drawn from the upper orders, members of society, and they spent 30 years in service to the Temple of Vestia. So if we were standing in the imperial palace here in Rome, we would be looking down on the Temple of Vestia. And it was at this temple that the hearth fires of Rome were kept. And so their task was to essentially guard the heartbeat, if you will, the flame of the city. And this is where people would come and collect heat. They would collect fire for their homes. And so in a way, this was the heart of the city. And all of the citizens would come and glean something, blood, if you will. But in this case, we're talking about heat, that would keep their homes functioning. And of course, as we know, chastity was central to this particular cult. Women did not have a choice about whether or not they wanted to be part of this cult. It was, of course, a great honor for your daughter to be one of these women. If a woman from one of these upper ordered families wanted to marry and have children, but was chosen or offered, she did not get to decide yes or no. it was simply a yes. If a woman was not from one of these important families and wanted not to marry or have children or be someone's concubine, but wanted to be a vestal, she did not have the option to do so. So this wasn't something into which women necessarily, this wasn't a position they chose. And of course, there were women who did want this and were able to access it. So we know that some women benefited by this system, but not all. Nevertheless, the point being, this was a public expression of chastity and devotion and dedication to this very important goddess figure. Another example of public religion that is very important for the development of Christianity is the cult of the emperor. Here we have Julius Caesar, known as the Divine Julius, and here we have his nephew, Octavian, known as the Son of the Divine. So these titles matter for Christianity because you have this figure here, Julius, who's understood as the divine, and you have his nephew here known as the Son of the Divine. Or to put it more obviously, here you have God and here you have the Son of God. And I point this out because it's important to recognize that God and Son of God are terms that people know during the lifetime of Jesus. It's also worth pointing out here these two little qualities that give us insight into the fact that this is a figure who is viewed as divine. Here we have this little putti, this little Cupid-like figure that points to Octavian's divine heritage, and then also the fact that he's barefoot, which is how divine figures were pictured or depicted in art and in statuary. The barefoot means divine. So did people believe that these imperial figures were gods and goddesses? Well, first of all, if there is a variety of approaches to the divine, then sure. But on another level, there were many people who just understood this as loyalty. And so for them, it wasn't problematic. You view your imperial figure in a certain way. You are grateful to them for the benefits that they provide for you. And so you honor them publicly through small sacrifices and language. And so this will be problematic for Jews, of course, who will be in time exempted from honoring and participating in the cult of the emperor. But Christians, when they emerge, are not Jews. And so for the Romans, it's going to be a problem when Christians refuse to participate in this particular activity.